Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Neuvillette post-release analysis. Now, let's very quickly just address the small little elephant in the room. My pre-release analysis got taken down by Hoyoverse. I have contested the strike. As of recording this, it is still not back up because they have up to 10 days to contest my contest, basically. But it's not 10 days, it's 10 business days. Anyway, so I have to use a re-upload. We're going to be using this ever so slightly different version instead of the original one. So if there's like slight discrepancies between what you see here and what you see in the original pre-release videos, that's why. Anyways, let's get into it. We can skip over, as usual, the like description of things and head into the actual analysis.
Let's get into the passives. So, in other words, for every Hydro reaction that you can trigger on your team, you gain more damage with him. You actually do get a pretty large amount of damage from it. However, he is balanced around being a Hydro unit and how good Hydro is to trigger reactions, meaning that if you focus on just getting 3 stacks and increasing his personal damage as much as possible, you're unlikely to get as good results as if you're focusing on the actual reactions that you're triggering.
And okay,
finally,
so
for each one,
let's talk about this a little bit. Also, one thing that I don't think I ended up mentioning, this was before a nerf. He was nerfed in beta. This 2 stack was changed from 130 to 125, which is what we have on live right now, which slightly increases the incentive to go for 3 different reactions. I think the main thing though here is that there's a lot of teams where getting a second copy of whatever element can be quite useful, but just going for all different elements isn't actually that big of a downgrade, especially when you play less energy reliant units. And because a lot of the units that work fairly well with him are less energy reliant, there ends up being a decent amount of teams where getting a last element in your team isn't actually a huge downside. Basically, the teams where you stick to 3 different elements total, including Hydro, are good, but I think I slightly underestimated the teams where you go 4 different elements. We'll get into that a little bit more once we talk about the teams.
The absence of an HP equivalent to Bennett makes it so that Neuvillette won't be an amazing hyper carry, but he has enough damage in his kit that he will still do reasonable damage in teams where his main quote-unquote purpose is like a driver / on-fielder for on-field Hydro, right? So either for like a Hyperbloom team or for like a Taser team or a Burgeon team or something like that. He will still get pretty decent personal damage without you focusing on his personal damage.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about like quote-unquote hyper carry teams. There's been a lot of, I don't want to say debate, but a lot of people have labeled Neuvillette as a hyper carry. A lot of people have labeled him as not a hyper carry. And I, the CEO of Genshin Impact Meta, I am here to clear things up. A hyper carry is a term that's used to describe a character who is basically the only character in the team who's doing damage, where the rest of the team, rather than being focused on themselves doing damage, it's focused on increasing his damage. Because of that, Neuvillette can be played in teams where he would be considered a hyper carry. He can also be played in teams where he would not be considered a hyper carry. In other words, he can do both. One of the things that we're going to get into a little bit later once we start getting into teams is that there's a lot of his teams where even when you have other damage sources outside of him, they're not doing that much damage, or it's kind of scuffed to get them to do their damage properly, to the point where even if you end up playing him with like Fischl, for example, there's a lot of situations where you still kind of want to treat him as a quote-unquote hyper carry, where Fischl's main purpose is to provide you with Electrocharge for his Ascension 1 passive, but also she is doing damage. But as we're going to get into a little bit later, some of the setups with Fischl in his Taser teams are actually pretty ping dependent, which means that higher ping players are going to struggle to do those setups and will basically tend to decide to give up on some of Fischl's damage by giving up on the Electro Swirl just to reliably get the Hydro Swirls. Anyways, as I said, we're going to get into this a lot more once we get into the teams. One more thing I want to add on the hyper carry versus not hyper carry thing is that the current Abyss has a Blessing of the Abyssal Moon that is incredibly broken on Neuvillette. It's giving him 48% normal and charge attack damage bonus, which is more than a goblet because his burst and skill are a very small portion of his damage. So basically almost all of his damage is getting about 1 goblet's worth of additional damage percent for free. That's a pretty big deal. And in teams that focus more on his personal damage, well, that big increase to damage is affecting a larger portion of the team's DPS, which is going to give people a slightly skewed perception of how his hypercarry teams compared to his non-hypercarry teams. There's also obviously the topic of like the Neuvillette solo runs right now, which are also incredibly affected by how just how broken the blessing is for him.
He just doesn't have access to as many ways of increasing his damage, which means that unless you're starting to look at High Constellation, which we will take a look at his Constellation in a second, but unless you're looking at High Constellation, he's not really a hypercarry. That's not where his kit is going to shine.
Yeah, so I still stand by that. I still think that his hypercarry teams are not his best ones, but it is worth mentioning that while they're not his best ones, they're also not far behind in my opinion. I still don't think they're his best teams, but they are better than I gave them credit for. And one of the main upsides that they have is, especially when it comes to like speedrunning stuff, they tend to scale better with higher artifact investment. Also just not necessarily whale, but also just dolphin investment, right? Or even free to play, but like vertical, whatever, right? And they can front load damage pretty well, which helps a lot against enemies that have HP gates like Magukenki and stuff like that.
Yeah, it doesn't actually say it here, but you know, I've seen the footage. He can move during this as well. And not only can he move, he's moving at the same speed as if he wasn't charge attacking, which means, and especially considering the fact that he has pretty high range on this, he can kite very easily. Which means
this is one of the things that I think I got the most accurately in the pre-release. While resistance to interruption can be nice, like at the beginning of your charge attack, because often you'll do like E into burst and then start charge attacking, and the burst has a fairly long animation, which makes it so that by the time your burst is over, enemies are probably pretty close to you, so it's possible that you get staggered at the start of your charge attack. If you get past that start of your charge attack, you're not really gonna get staggered anymore. There are some enemies that can still stagger you, but interruption resistance is not that big of a deal on him. Especially when it comes to characters that either provide a small shield or interruption resistance for a short period of time. Just being able to get resistance to interruption for the first charge attack is generally enough for the rest as well. So if you're looking at any Geo character that you can put in his teams, even characters like Albedo, that crystallized shield can actually be enough resistance to interruption because it's enough to get your first charge attack going, and then you can like kite backwards. Even Goro, although I wouldn't play Goro in his teams just because he's not doing anything other than crystallized. Characters like Beidou, characters like Dehya, who has short resistance to interruption, but very strong. We'll talk a bit more about Dehya in a minute. It effectively makes it so that the additional resistance to interruption from his C1, it's useful, obviously, but it's not a game changer. It's not an insane, wow, huge constantly. It's not, you don't get as much use out of it as you get from like the charge attacks not costing stamina on Hu Tao's C1, right? It's a nice little upside, but it's not the main one. The main upside from C1 is the other part of it.
The main thing that makes the C1 actually pretty decent is not the interruption resistance, is that it makes it so that you can get one more stack of this without needing one more hydro reaction. Having looked at a lot of the teams where he'll be able to work, in my opinion, he is mainly going to see play in teams that only trigger 2 hydro-related elemental reactions.
Yeah, so I don't really think so anymore. I think he's still going to be very good in teams that only trigger 2, but there's definitely something to be said about quote-unquote suboptimal team synergies just to get that additional stack.
C4, when you're healed, you will generate a source water droplet. This effect can occur once every 4 seconds. What this is going to mean is that if you have a form of off-field healing, you'll be able to charge attack a lot more consistently, and you'll be less reliant on using your skill and burst for it.
Another thing that it means, I guess, is that when you do E plus burst, you get droplets for 3 charge attacks. Well, you get each charge attack is about 4 seconds apart and heals you when you start it. So you can get 1 droplet for each of those charge attack and then get 3 additional droplets generated and get a 4th charge attack. And maybe more importantly, because usually that's not going to be that big of a deal because you can just use another skill. Maybe more importantly, the way that his I guess, tracking. I don't know what word I'd use. When you have more than 3 orbs on the ground, he's gonna pick up certain orbs. I don't know exactly how it works, but I do know that sometimes he picks up the wrong ones, and the orbs that are the oldest stay on the ground instead of being picked up when he picks up the new ones. And when that happens, the old ones can expire before you actually pick them up. But at the end of the day, the main use of C4 is going to be to synergize with C6.
All in all, I think that he's got some kind of interesting constellations where basically each of these constellations, except I guess C5, is like a nice little upgrade. And because he's not really designed to be a hyper carry at C0, getting C1 won't make him do enough damage to be competitive with other hyper carries, right? So just keep that in mind.
Okay. I think that was wrong. He definitely does compete with other hyper carries if you have C1 or his signature. Again, right, it's pretty hard to evaluate properly because this Abyss is just so good for him, and non-Abyss enemies are too squishy for it to ever really be all that easy to tell how well a character performs, because they'll just die to half a rotation and you're just left there like, oh, okay. I think the main thing is, what I was looking at this, I was basically only looking at it from the lens of like, you play him as a hyper carry with like Kazuha, Zhongli, and another character that's like trying to buff him. And with this, it would be like, I guess Mona or something. And while with that C1, it's a fairly like alright team. I mean, we'll get into it in a second, but there's one team where it, maybe even more so of like a traditional hyper carry style, that I might like a bit more. Anyways.
Technically, you could use 1,000 Floating Dreams, but you only get 30% damage from it, which is less than some of the free-to-play options, so it's just not really worth it.
Okay, let's talk about this, actually. So, I think this is the moment where I have to introduce the team that I was talking about. In my excitement for the interesting teams that you could do with Neuvillette, I unfortunately forgot the one most important tenet of Genshin Impact meta, which is, oh, it's always Xiangling!
An inconvenience for them.
Solidify. Be sanctified. Settle down.
You're toast!
This is what the rotation's supposed to look like, right? And then you just follow it up with a few more charge attacks. Do it against this guy. Now, obviously, keep in mind, very high resistance when the shield is not broken, and I'm not going to bother breaking the shield, so just keep that in mind.
Silent. Stabilize.
Boba, get them!
The tides beckon.
Wind strike.
Ah, fuck. I have encountered the main issue with the team, which is that I am not good enough to play it.
Settle.
Nice and spicy!
Let the mighty be humbled. Silent.
Wind strike.
Stabilize.
You're toast! Boba, get them!
One of my things expired.
Settle down. Solidify.
Act right, Pip!
The tides beckon.
Not my most well-played team, or not my most well-played run, but anyways, when you play this team properly, what effectively ends up happening is you don't obviously vape every single hit from Neuvillette's charge attack because, well, he has ICD, but you do vape anywhere between a third and a half, generally closer to a third because some of the hits will just be your Hydro App. You can also vape his burst, which in my case isn't that big of a deal because, yeah, but if you're not a f***ing dumbass like me, is a nice amount of additional front-loaded damage. All in all, this is just a fairly decent decent team for him. This is the team I was talking about where like it's very good for like speedruns and stuff like that. I think it has a lot of issues, namely that it's pretty hard to actually like maintain good play on it. And when you fuck one thing up, like if you fuck up your Hydro Swirl, you can't really use Kazuha's burst unless you do some weird like Guoba thing. But having done it a few times, I don't like it too much. It doesn't really allow for you to get your Hydro Crystallize. If you don't have Hydro Aura on the enemy when you crystallize, then Zhongli's just... I struggle to reliably get good rotations. And I think I play a little bit better than the average player, so I definitely think that's something where a lot of people will also struggle. That being said, if you are playing a team like this, 1000 Floating Dreams is actually not bad, because the EM is not a wasted stat anymore. So it's not just 30% damage bonus, it's 30% damage bonus and 265 EM and a little bit of EM for the rest of your team, which will slightly increase like Kazuha's buff and damage, but that part is not that big of a deal. I'll get into talking a little bit more about this team specifically later on, but it's relevant here because it will make EM weapons in those specific teams a little bit stronger. Another thing that I didn't include here is sacrificial fragments, and just like 1000 Floating Dreams, it's a potential thing you can use in this team. Although personally I haven't liked it as much because in terms of like output, it's not really better than having the HP from Prototype Amber, and usually your rotations allow for you to get enough droplets for all of your charge attacks anyways, which means that sac just doesn't help that much unless it's like an overworld where you don't want to always have to use your burst or stuff like that. Anyways, let's keep going.
Everlasting Moonglow is kind of interesting, I guess, where like it's slightly more HP than Prototype Amber, but the passive is a lot worse. I don't think I would really recommend it in any situation.
You know, one thing that is pretty funny about this is with Moonglow, you will be healing a little bit more from your charge attacks. So I guess technically it makes you a little bit tankier, but yeah, it really doesn't matter.
Obviously, his signature weapon is his best weapon. I think if you're a free-to-play player who wants to vertically invest into him, this is actually fairly interesting compared to his constellations. If you're not a free-to-play player, we'll get into the Battle Pass weapons later, which might make it less worth to go for his signature than to go for his constellations. But for free-to-play players that just can't buy the Battle Pass, but that have saved up for him, this should generally do quite a bit more than going for his Constellation 1.
Right. Yeah, I do mostly stand by that. I think that it can be slightly alleviated by if you end up going for Furina, which is another thing that we'll talk about once we get to teams, but we have had some Furina information, which means that the ways in which his non-rainbow teams, right, his teams that don't have 4 different elements perform, like that's going to get affected by Furina. Anyways.
So this weapon is kind of good. The EM doesn't matter, right? It's about the HP.
Again, right, the EM doesn't matter that much, but it is actually fairly useful if you do end up playing him with Xiangling.
Widsith is like, haha, funny number. Both the attack buff and the EM buff on Widsith are useful.
So again, right, it's another weapon that has an EM stat, so it's another weapon where it can actually be a decent amount better than I give it credit for here when you're playing him with Xiangling.
Fav Codex, I've already mentioned, right? Potentially best in slot 4-star, if very high ER.
Yeah, I think units that synergize well with him tend to generate a decent amount of energy, even if they're not Hydro, which means that his ER requirements don't actually tend to be that insanely high. So Fav being his like best option is very, very situational. That being said, Fav is very nice in Overworld and for like domain farming, just like Sackfrag, because whereas Sackfrag gives you more ease so you don't have to use burst, Fav makes it so that you press EQ and you already have the energy for your next burst.
Artifact sets, 4-piece, Marechaussee. No other set is even worth considering.
Yeah. When you look at how much damage you gain from it, it's not really that much more than if you were to go for like Vermilion on Chao. And a lot of people talk about how like farming Vermilion on Chao isn't really that worth unless you really want to main Chao. But the thing is, the artifact domain where you get Marechaussee does not have echoes as its other set. It has Golden Troop, which is actually a very good set, which means that you're not actually sacrificing things for farming it.
It is worth mentioning, though, that because you're using Marechaussee, if you're also using a weapon that gives a lot of crit rate or crit damage, then you can actually get to the point where you have so much crit that you're starting to hit crit diminishing returns, which can actually make HP/Hydro/HP okay. I wouldn't recommend HP Circlet if you're using something like an HP main or HP substat weapon, because it's like far enough behind that it's very unlikely that you have an HP Circlet with good enough substat.
Yeah, so I say that, but as you can see, I do not follow my own advice. I am using an HP Circlet. The main reason for that is because my crit circlets don't have as much ER, and I like having at least 130 ER, because I feel like at lower than that, it's a lot more cringe. You miss out on ER requirements. More energy recharge is always going to be more comfortable, and once you reach enough damage to clear content, getting slightly more damage just doesn't do much. And getting more ER, making things more comfortable, can be just more valuable just because of that. And because it's not that far behind, I can justify it.
Alright, next up, teams. Neuvillette works everywhere. His Hydro application on his charge attack is good, which means that he can be used as a Hydro enabler. That being said, I still wouldn't really use him in like Xiangling teams because I think there are better options, but he will be functional.
Okay, so here, I wasn't talking about teams in general where Xiangling is in the team. I was talking mainly about like national teams where Xiangling is built for damage and you would be using him as Hydro application to vape Xiangling's damage, right? Like in context, I think it's clear that's what I'm saying because I talk about how you can use his Hydro application for things and then I talk about Xiangling, right? Right? He can be used as a Hydro enabler, but maybe not with Xiangling. And that's true. I still don't really like him in national teams where you use him with Bennett Xiangling, but I actually do see the value in using Xiangling as an enabler for him. One thing though, and you might have noticed this when I was showing the team earlier, if you stay in place, your Pyro App will not be enough. You have to spin around the enemy while you're doing your charge attack to increase the speed of your Pyro App with Xiangling. Otherwise, your Hydro will overtake.
Outside of that, I would say that his main two teams will be Hyperbloom and Taser.
Okay, I think that's the case, yes. But there is a lot of caveats that go into it.
Also makes it so that if you have Raiden, she will generally tend to be a better option than Kuki in his Hyperbloom teams because it lets you stay pretty far away from the enemies and you don't really need the healing. Kuki is still very functional, it'll just be a little bit harder to play. When it comes to the Dendro part,
I will say though, and it's something I've mentioned in the meta roundup, which should come out before this video, the current Abyss makes Kuki feel a lot worse because when you play him in Hyperbloom teams, this boss keeps knocking you away and it's not an attack that you can dodge. Like you can dodge the damage, but you can't dodge the knockback because it's not actually stagger, it's just pushing your character. And it can knock you away from your Hyperbloom seeds, which feels really bad when it happens right before a Kuki proc and then you just miss the Hyperblooms. Anyways.
and then finally you have your last slot. So what do you want as your last slot?
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Yelan and Xingqiu as like the last options. They're both okay, but again, right, you're not getting anywhere close to full value out of their kit. They're alright, not because they are actually particularly good in the team, just because there's no good options yet. The main reason why people tend to somewhat like a Hydro unit as the last slot in his teams is not because the Hydro units are all that good in the teams, it's because his lack of off-field Hydro makes his setups for like getting your swirl on Kazuha and or your crystallize on Zhongli so f***ing scuffed. And being able to have that off-field Hydro up from a different character will make your setups a lot easier to do, a lot more simple. And that can be enough because obviously, right, Abyss isn't so hard that only insanely good teams will be able to clear. So being able to just have your setups be easier to do is a very nice thing. And as we're going to talk about as well, some of his setups are even ping dependent, which just sucks. Because if you have high ping, you're not going to be able to do them, and having that off-field Hydro will basically let you fix that. You also get the Hydro Resonance, but as I've mentioned earlier, like, it's not that big of a deal. It's just a nice little upside that you're getting on top of everything. It's not the reason why you want to put a Hydro unit as the last slot. The main reason is just so that you get more reliable setups, more reliable Hydro swirls. But when you are doing that, then out of the current Hydro options, Mona tends to be the best one. Child can be fine because he doesn't have long animations. Like, he doesn't actually really have to do anything, and his E applies to you, and so does his burst, which can make your setups easy, which is kind of funny. But like, just using Child as your Hydro for your setups, because he doesn't have long animations, you get like the normal attack stuff for free. It's a thing, I guess. I don't think it's like the best. I know that people use it for speedruns because of how much faster the animations are, but it's really not like it's not particularly good outside of those situations.
Right now, we don't really have Hydro characters that synergize particularly well with him in Hyperloom teams. Does that mean we never will? No, having done the Archon quest and looked at the dynamic between Neuvillette and Furina, that Furina is going to be designed to work with his teams.
Yeah, she is. I'm not gonna get too much into talking about Furina because there's going to be Furina pre-release where I'll be doing that. But I can talk about her a little bit. Do keep in mind, right? When it comes to Furina, she's still fairly early into beta. And more importantly, it's Golden Week, yeah. So we didn't get any changes based on beta feedback this Monday. And that doesn't mean they're not going to change her. It just means they have the week off. There very well may be some more beta changes for Furina. If there are changes before this video ends up being posted and they are relevant to Neuvillette, I'll be recording something to add here. But if not, check the pinned comment to make sure that there hasn't been something or any announced changes since. And even then, even if there are no announced changes, that doesn't mean there will not be changes. So take everything about Furina with a grain of salt. Effectively, she's a fairly similar unit to Yelan and Xingqiu in the sense that she has off-field damage and hydro application, but with a few key differences. At a baseline, she does less damage. Her damage is on skill. Oh, and her hydro application is worse. In exchange for those two things, her burst significantly increases your team's damage percent based on how much your HP fluctuates. That includes her own damage, which means that there are situations where she can do more damage than Xingqiu or Yelan. But again, at a baseline, that's not necessarily the case. That buff can become pretty big if you manipulate your own HP a lot, like with characters like Neuvillette. She also consumes your team's HP, which means that you can get some more stacks from that, and if you get healers, but whatever. We'll talk about her in a lot more detail once we get to her pre-release. But in the meantime, when it comes to her synergy with Neuvillette, she deals her damage without it being reliant on normal attacks, which means that unlike Xingqiu and Yelan, she actually works with him properly. And Neuvillette works with her because he makes her buff bigger by having his HP go up and down whenever he uses his charge attack. Every time he uses his charge attack, his HP goes up from absorbing the droplets, and then it goes down over time from the charge attack consuming his HP. All in all, once Furina gets released, his double hydro teams, instead of it being like a thing you can do to like make your setups easier, but it's generally gonna be slightly weaker overall, it's just gonna become arguably his best team if you're playing her with him. In any case, a lot of these things don't actually relate to Hyperbloom too much. You'll obviously be able to play Furina in his Hyperbloom team, but this was mostly in general. Now, we're gonna start talking a little bit more about specifically the Hyperbloom stuff. So again, right, the other Hydro units in Hyperbloom, like they work, but they're not like that insane. So let's talk about the other elements that you can use in your Hyperbloom team.
Okay, in Hyperbloom teams, your last slot, maybe not a Hydro unit. So what else could you have? Well, you could have a second Dendro unit that lets you have some more Dendro application, but even though he does have fairly fast Hydro application, it's not so fast that Nahida won't be able to apply enough Dendro.
Yeah, so he has fairly good on-field hydro application, but he doesn't have any off-field application. And because of that, in basically every situation, Nahida will be more than enough Dendro. And if anything, Nahida applies so much Dendro that Neuvillette can struggle to get through that aura to end up with a Hydro aura, which will matter a little bit more later on. Playing a Dendro unit as the last option here is like probably the worst thing you can do, because you don't get one more stack, you don't get more app, you just don't get shit.
Another option is going for a second Electro unit.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about Beidou. I do stand by what I said about Beidou, although whenever you're against single targets, Beidou's damage falls off a cliff and is just not all that good anymore. And when that's the case, you would rather be able to get a third stack on his passive instead of using Beidou. Which means when you're against AoE content, Beidou is pretty good. I like using Beidou when I'm doing domains. I like using Beidou. I mean, I assume I would love using Beidou in events that are difficult but AoE. But in Abyss, recently they've been really going out of their way to put single target bosses on both sides in at least one of the chambers, which can make Beidou feel a lot worse. Like if you play Beidou on the first side against the Seahorse, she's Electro, so her damage is literally nothing, and it's single target, so it's even more than nothing. And because of that, even though she is pretty good on the other two, then it kind of feels bad to do. I think there's a bit better of an argument on the second side, just because this Abyss has arguably the hardest first, like its hardest chamber is arguably the first chamber rather than the others. So I think Beidou's still fine with him, but she's not gonna feel good on each chamber. She's only really gonna feel good on the first chamber. It's one of those things where like it's good in AoE, but especially with how Hoyo has been going out of their way to put single target in basically every abyss on both sides, it's maybe not like the best option you can have.
And I actually think that Beidou is going to be a really good teammate for him in quite a lot of teams.
Yeah, like she is a good teammate. Whenever you're in AoE content, I think Beidou is really good with him. But when you're not in AoE content, she feels bad.
You can also use Kazuha, but with his Hyperbloom teams at least, you have a lot of your damage that is either Nahida's Dendro damage or Hyperbloom damage, neither of which can be increased by Kazuha.
Okay, so while that is true, the fact that he doesn't really have insane last slot options that also give him a stack of his passive still means that even though Kazuha's not necessarily the best option, there is definitely more of an incentive to run him that I evaluated here. I think when you're playing him with Nahida, I don't like him as much because it's very hard to get a Hydro Aura when you're playing Nahida in a Hyperbloom team. Like it can happen, but it's gonna be pretty unreliable from the second rotation onwards because you have to get through the Dendro and not trigger Electro Charge because Electro Charge is going to take your Hydro Aura away. All in all, I think that Kazuha and Venti are especially good option in his Hyperbloom teams for people who don't have Nahida. So when you're looking at Dendro main character, for example, there's also the potential that you just kill enemies before your second rotation, which can make it easy to get your Hydro Swirl again because the next wave that spawns will not have Nahida's mark. I guess I can show it here.
Shine down.
Let the mighty be humble.
The wind knows me.
As you can see, if you can kill the first wave already, then not like the Nahida mark won't be a problem because you can just like the new wave won't have it anyways. But yeah, so you can still get your Kazuha buff in these teams. And this is really what I mean when I say that like I'm not that big of a fan of his hyper carry teams. It's that the biggest buff you can give him is Kazuha. Character like Zhongli will also increase his damage, but not by nearly as much, especially once you already have your VB. And as much as characters like Xiangling help with his vape, he can't vape all of his damage, only a portion of it. And even if you can vape it, unless you actually play well, your setups can be fairly difficult to do. And he can still have very good personal damage, even if you're not building the whole team specifically for a hyper carry team. Even if you have Raiden doing a bunch of damage with Hyperblooms. But yeah, you can also be running units like Sucrose instead of Kazuha, you can be running units like Venti.
Silent.
Animal hypostasis.
Shine down.
Ha! Germinate! Animal test 6308. Stand clear.
Let the mighty be humble.
Where's the big one? There he
Bow
is.
your head.
Enhanced animal.
Illusion shattered.
Scatter! Spring forth!
Be sanctified. Silence. Settle down.
Animal test 60.
There's one. We can also show it on single target.
Swirl. Mark.
Shine down.
Stand clear. Germinate!
The tides beckon. Silence.
Animal test 6308.
Oh my god.
Settle down.
Stand clear. Propagate! Ah!
Be sanctified. An oversight on my part. Silence.
Oh my. No! That is just a skill issue. I didn't have enough energy.
Settle down.
There I didn't get my Hydro Swirl, which was a skill issue, but it is what it is. on your first charge attack, you get good damage. On the second and third, you don't really have your Hydro Swirl anymore because it's just expired and you don't really want to swap out of him. There are some teams where you can, and that's really where having that double Hydro can be useful because it lets you get more reliably that Hydro Aura for another Hydro Swirl for like your next charge attacks, but you do lose out on a decent amount. In any case, let's keep going with other elements you can be using.
You can go for Zhongli if you want the defensive utility. Beidou.
Yeah, I don't like Zhongli as much because Zhongli's animation for his hold E and for his burst is pretty long, which means that you're going to have to make sure that like you have a lot of Hydro when you swap to him, otherwise you're not gonna get your Hydro crystallize. So yeah, in Hyperbloom teams, honestly, I just don't like Zhongli as much. It feels like it's very, very difficult from the second rotation onwards to actually get your stack, and not getting your stack is a pretty big downgrade.
You can go for a cryo unit and do some Hyperfridge stuff.
Okay, so this I like quite a bit. I think Hyperfridge is one of his stronger teams. Obviously, again, this is something that isn't going to do that much against the bosses, but you're at least still going to get your third stack. So even against bosses, it's not completely useless because you are at least getting your third stack, right? You can't freeze bosses, but you can trigger frozen against bosses. So you can still get the stack from triggering the reaction, even if it doesn't actually freeze. And when you're against non-bosses, then getting that freeze is just so comfortable. And this is one of the teams that I like quite a bit.
Although I would say that he has a little bit less synergy with Hyperfridge than some of the other teams that you'll be doing, because he does kind of want to keep his distance between him and enemies, which makes characters like Dehya work a little bit less.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but I also think that you can get away with using units like Lila pretty well. He actually works quite well with Lila. Both Lila and Diona, he works pretty well with them. So it's still pretty nice.
Technically, you can use Pyro units, but I generally wouldn't.
Okay, as a general rule, that's true. While he can work with Pyro units, generally you don't want to use them in Hyperbloom. However, there is one exception. A Pyro character that doesn't really apply enough Pyro to ever yoink Hyperblooms. But that does apply enough Pyro to trigger Burning, which will let you get a Vape, which will you get to Vape Neuvillette's damage, but you also get the stack on him very reliably. On top of that, she offers basically infinite resistance to interruption for a short duration, which on most on-fielders kind of sucks because, well, once it runs out, you can get interrupted and it's like she's not doing anything. But for Neuvillette, it's really just the first charge attack where you're particularly vulnerable, and after that, you can kite backwards. You can use your charge attack animation to kite backwards. So let me introduce you to Dehya in Hyperbloom. So, there's no real issue ever in AoE situations, right?
Let the mighty be humbled.
As you can see, we're getting some bigger damage on some hits of the charge attacks. That's just the Vapes doing their work.
Illusion shattered.
This may hurt a little. Make yourselves at home.
Oh my god, of course.
Be sanctified.
Alright, it's a nice little 76k there.
Settle down.
On some of the hits. Generally, the hits are obviously a lot lower than, come on. Did you just die? Thank you. A lot lower than they are in the teams that slot in an animal unit. But you don't have to worry about uptime, like, whatsoever. But yeah, so once you get to single target stuff, it's still very nice.
There is no
Grow. The Temple of Wisdom.
buckle up.
Be sanctified. Justice is blindsided.
Shine down.
A minute to memory. Make yourselves at home.
Let's get it up.
Let the mighty be humbled.
Now, obviously, if you were smarter than me, you see we've got some 83Ks. Now, do keep in mind, right? This blessing is very insane for him. The damage would be lower if it wasn't for the blessing.
Silence.
Illusion shattered.
Alright,
Grow.
the,
The Temple of Wisdom.
The tides beckon.
the resistance to interruption, pretty useful, right? Because you get to actually do your first charge attack.
There is no escape.
This may hurt a little. Share my knowledge.
Let's get it.
Be sanctified. Settle down.
Alright, and we get some pretty nice results. I don't know if I'd call this the strongest team with C0 Neuvillette, but it's definitely one of the stronger ones. And more importantly, it's a Dehya team. We finally have a Dehya team that actually kind of works. I think Dehya is the only power character that I would actually play in those Hyperbloom teams. That being said though, this team doesn't really work with Dendro main character, because with Dendro main character, you don't have a need to have a unit that can reliably get your third stack through Nehida's Great Wall of Dendro, which is the main reason why, unless you're in multi-wave content, Kazuha, Sucrose, Venti tend to feel a bit worse with Neuvillette's Hyperbloom teams. So if you don't have Nehida and you're using DMC instead, then those units don't have that they don't have that downside anymore, because it's easy to get through the Dendro app from DMC when the burst expires, right? So you can get a second Hydro Scroll in the second rotation. Anyways,
I think all four of these are fairly viable. I think that just when it comes to the team synergy, Hyperbloom plus Electro will be the nicest. However,
I don't think that's the case anymore. I think it's mostly Hyperfridge and that team with Dehya that have the most inherent synergy, especially when you're using Nehida. When you're not using Nehida, there's more of an argument for the animal version. The Hyperbloom plus Electro is nice when in the content where Beidou is good. It's also fine if you're using Fischl instead, but the other options allowing you to have some defensive utility that let you get your first charge attacks out more easily, like if you're using Lila or Dehya, actually do feel kind of nice. And the versions with Animo that obviously give you grouping, which is also very useful, also feels pretty nice. Although I will say he's a bit less reliant on grouping. Now here's where I should talk about the f***ing spin tech. If you increase your mouse sensitivity, your DPI to like really, really high, you can basically spin as fast as possible while you're holding down your charge attack. And the way that the charge attack is coded is it doesn't do them at like fixed intervals. It's like the beam is always there, and it's kind of like there's an internal cooldown on enemies taking damage, which means as long as the beam is passing through enemies all the time, you can get almost the maximum amount of damage, but basically in a 360 radius around him. However, you will get motion sickness. I have never experienced motion sickness before in my life, and I experienced it for the first time looking at people do the spin tech. I am physically unable to watch it. It also means that your mouse is gonna have a lot higher sensitivity, just in general, not just for when you're doing its charge attack. Maybe if you have a way to like change your DPI in real time with one button, you can do it. If that's something you're willing to do, then yeah, that's a technique you can do. Personally, I don't really like it, but it is a thing you can do. That being said, it is useful to know that even if you're not doing a full spin, if you manage to like do an arc between enemies that hits all the enemies you want to hit, you'll still get effectively the same results. Right, I'm hitting all this arc even if I'm not doing a full spin, and my mouse sensitivity is not high enough for me to be able to do a big spin. So anyways,
that's one of the things that I like the most about him, is that he's got so many small variations that can make the teams feel very different, right?
That is a that is something that I think I got right in the pre-release, that it really is a big deal. If you have a lot of different units, there's going to be a lot of situations where you could get slightly better results changing one unit. The optimal team with him is going to be very situation dependent, which I like a lot. I think that's really nice. However, this is something that I don't think I touched on enough in my pre-release. I really do think that his teams, it's not that he's bad if you don't have his best teams, but his best teams very often tend to have a lot of 5 stars. While there's still some upsides to playing Dendro units that aren't Nehida in his teams, because you get to play like the Animo stuff, it still generally tends to perform worse if you're not using Nehida. Raiden feels a lot better with him in his Hyperloom team than Kuki does. Kazuha gives you just a lot more than Sucrose does in his teams. So does Venti. Zhongli in his Hyper teams like helps a decent amount. It's not that he needs to be with those units to perform, but there are definitely situations where if you don't have those options, he feels a bit worse to play. Now, I've done a lot of testing on 4-star only teams with him. Well, obviously he's not a 4-star, but where the units other than him are only 4 stars. And I'm still clearing. Obviously, this Abyss is it's really good for him, so it's hard to get a good idea for it. And I think he's strong enough that even if you don't have the optimal teams for him, you'll still be able to get like fine results. But I really do think that, like, unfortunately, the best results you can get are fairly reliant on a lot of 5-star units that have good synergy with him. Yeah, like you can clear with literally just a team that doesn't do anything just to get his stacks, because in this Abyss he's just so strong, right? And the fact that he has high range paired with the fact that he heals himself a lot helps a lot when it comes to like skill issue. Neuvillette is a character that alleviates skill issue very well.
Next up, we have Taser.
Actually, since I was talking about Electro, or about Taser, let's talk about his setups in Taser teams. So this is generally what people look at as a Taser core. And you can use 2 girls instead, obviously, but generally Kazuha tends to perform better when you're not on fielding the animal unit in Taser. If you just do this into this into this, you can get your Hydro Swirl, right? But if you start having high ping, right? You do this. Oh no, no Hydro Swirl. If you get hit after you use Fischl E, oh no. If you use your burst, no Hydro Swirl. And I didn't swap as soon as I could because I just wanted to show if you have just a little bit of ping that's gonna delay your swaps a little bit, it's Jover. Now there are ways to work around this. So for example, I'm not gonna use E because it's on cooldown and I don't want to wait, but you use your E, and then before you swap to Fischl, you use Kazuha's burst. Then you go to Fischl and then back to Kazuha. And then it's very easy to get your swirl. However, on your second rotation, I don't know why Oz isn't attacking. I guess he thinks he's too far because he's dumb. Oops. Oh my god, I keep not being able to swap into him. Whatever.
Settle down.
On the second rotation, it might not work out because you might still have Electro, you might still have Oz active. If some pieces in your rotation are a little bit late or a little bit early, you can end up with Oz still out for your next rotation, which means that you won't be able to do this anymore, because if Oz is out when you do this, when you use your E, how is...
I summon.
Right?
Bow your
Fallen leaves, adorn my night.
You don't get your Electro Swirl from your Kazuha burst because your Hydro expires by the time your burst animation is over. And this is where some of the issues with Taser teams can lie, where if you have high ping, you're kind of... And like, yeah, you can always just do something like that beginning that I mentioned.
By royal decree.
The tides beckon.
And then do Oz, or do your Oz refresh a little bit early, so that your Oz hopefully expires by the time you do your next rotation. Wow, whatever. Right? And then you can get it. And like, it's doable, but it's something that you're gonna have to keep in mind. And it does make the rotations a lot harder to execute. And it's not just that it's harder to execute, it's that you can get punished a decent amount. Like, if your whole team is built around swirling his Hydro to increase his damage, and you don't swirl Hydro, well, this sucks. If you're adding a Geo unit, it becomes even harder, because you need to get it twice. You need to get it for the Crystallize to get a Hydro Crystallize, and you need to get it for the swirl.
Settle down.
Right, and if we do this... Oh, no Hydro Crystallize. Rip Bozo. You can trigger it with the pillar after, in the middle of your rotation, but that's assuming your pillar is actually hitting the enemies, which, if you've ever played Zhongli, you know doesn't always happen. But basically, because of this, I think that there's a lot of variations of these teams that become a little bit better just because of the potential unreliability of getting your swirls. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people like playing the Hydro units as the last slot. In any case, I think I overestimated Taser with him. Because of his lack of off-field Hydro, because of it makes his swirls often unreliable, and in some cases, basically impossible with higher ping. And because, well, you're getting a decent amount of damage from him, I've been liking just not doing Taser and doing other stuff instead. Yeah, Furina will help a lot in his Taser teams. It will make them a lot more, it will make them feel a lot better to play. I think Zhongli is still going to be a little bit better because you are going to get Petra and you're going to get Shred on not just his damage, but also Furina's damage. But Taser won't be far behind in those teams. Anyways, let's move on to other archetypes.
Soup teams when it comes to Sugokomon, because he won't have off-field Hydro, which can make it a lot harder.
Yeah, I don't like him in Soup at all. I think Soup is just not very good with him because it makes it even harder to get your setups when you add another element that you want to swirl.
They have some Burgeon archetypes. The main thing that makes it so that these teams will very often perform better than just straight up Burgeon teams is the fact that when you're attacking an enemy with the elements that you use for Burgeon, sometimes you'll trigger Burning, and when you trigger Burning, if you attack them with Hydro, you're only going to get Vaporized. You're not going to get a Bloom Seed generated, which means that you effectively...
Yeah, so let's actually show how that works out in practice. If we actually get enough Pyro App that we
I'll bring my seed.
vape all the vapeable hits on Neuvillette.
Committed to memory. Yeah. Nice and spicy. Eat this.
Let the mighty be humble.
Right, so we got one Bloom Seed there. No Bloom Seeds there. Yeah, as you can see, we're not getting blooms, right? We're getting a very small amount, but it's very, very marginal. However, as soon as you have any way of weakening the burning aura while you're doing this, also I'll fucking stop channeling to the right build because she does not have enough here. Okay.
Bow your head.
By royal decree. Make yourselves a room. After fry pan, into the fire. You'll
Be sanctified. Justice.
I am bad.
Sighted.
I am so bad. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it.
Bow your head.
odds. Sharing my knowledge. You're toast.
The tides beckon.
Midnight, fantastic.
Be not perturbed. Unscathed.
I'm just bad, man.
By royal decree. The Temple of Wisdom. Eat this. Nice and spicy.
Settle down as you wish, mate. Let the mighty be humble.
But yeah, we are actually getting some Burgeons, even if it's not that many, when we actually play an archetype like this. Now, obviously, you still have issues, obviously, with resistance to interruption. This is not a team that I actually like that much, but it is a way where, like, you can actually get some Burgeons while playing a team like this. Now, something else that you can do is just give up on the Burgeons altogether. And, like, yeah, you might still get some Burgeons, but really go all in on using it as Pyro App to vape his stuff more reliably. So with something like this.
Be sanctified.
Committed to memory. Sharing my knowledge. Hey, yeah. After fry pan.
And as you can see, right, we lose our VV uptime fairly early into it starting. So it's a bit unfortunate in that sense. But it is a nice way of at least very reliably getting your Hydro Swirl and your VV uptime. And finally, you can also use a unit like Lila or Diona, or I guess Rosaria, in the team. And it is also fairly decent. Now, I don't have a leveled up Lila, unfortunately. I think Lila's the best unit to slot in here. You can use Suit Girls as well, that's true. And one of the nice things about this is you don't actually need to remove the Dendro Aura to get a Cryo app, to get your Hydro reaction with Cryo.
Temple of Wisdom.
The tides beckon.
Right. So a team like that can work quite well. Obviously, you're gonna trigger some Burgeon, so you need your, if you're playing with Lila, you need your shield to actually be very tanky. But this is another team where it works well. I think when it comes to like pure Burgeon archetypes, this is my favorite one. The ones that use Aquarian as the last option. Keep in mind, you will actually be able to reliably reverse melt a decent amount of your cryo units damage, so you can also build a bunch of EM on them. But because you're playing a rainbow team, because all of your units are different elements, your ER requirements will be fairly high, and getting Fav weapons is going to help quite a lot. Anyway, let's keep going.
You can use Dehya, but that's also pretty out because you're just not going to Burgeon that much, and the uptime is shit.
Yeah, I don't like Dehya very much in those Burgeon teams. I do think the uptime is too bad.
Each of these archetypes also has an additional upside. The Oven archetype also has freeze, and freezing enemies can help.
Yeah, you're not actually going to trigger freeze. Like, you'll trigger the frozen reaction during your setup, but you're not actually freezing the enemies because you have too much pyro up. But you do get to rev melt your cryo units damage. Because you're not actually getting freeze, right? His Hydro app is not nearly as much as Xingqiu, who's like the other unit that's usually used in Oven teams, which makes the way that the auras act like pretty different from what how they usually act in those Oven teams where you use Xingqiu. I've decided that the team behaves differently enough to deserve a new name. And now, obviously, as I'm sure many of you are aware, you should not let me name teams, because you're not gonna like the names I come up with. So get ready for another new, way too dank team name. Let me introduce you to Bain-Marie. Bain-Marie, or Double Boiler, or Water Bath, is a piece of equipment that's used notably in cooking to heat things gently or to keep things warm over a long period of time. And it's also used to melt cooking ingredients. So it's a water thing that's used to melt things. Tell me with a straight face that's not an amazing team. That's not an amazing name for this team. And then on top of that, it's French, and because it's with Neuvillette, and I'll talk about it as well in the Risley pre-release. I don't know if that's coming out before or after this video, but if it's not out yet, you'd know it's coming out soon, and if it is, go watch it. It's also something you'll be able to do with Furina in a Risley team. It's a Fontaine thing, you know, so it's gotta be French. Anyways, the main upsides for it is you get to actually forward vape your hydro damage, you get to reverse melt your cryo damage, and you get to still trigger some Burgeons fairly reliably. Now, the faster your cryo app, the better in teams like this, right? Ideally, you want to have cryo app that's faster than your hydro app. That's unfortunately not going to be the case in this team, so it's not ideal, but you know, it's still pretty nice. Anyways, let's keep going.
You can try to use him in like a wannabe hyper team with like Kazuha, Zhongli, but then you don't have a last slot that actually helps.
Yeah, so again, right, I made the criminal mistake of not thinking it was always Xiangling. Xiangling is very good in the last slot. But again, right, it is reliant on you actually rotating around the enemy properly. And yeah, because it's a team where you don't actually vape Xiangling's damage and she's not getting Bennett buff and she's probably not getting a Pyro Swirl either, it doesn't really matter if she's not built for damage. So you just build her on Fav with full ER, and her ER requirements aren't actually that big of a deal when you do that.
But I think outside of Soup, basically every single one of these teams will be overall about as good as each other with different strengths and weaknesses.
That's not really the case. I think there are some archetypes that stand a little bit above the others. I think the main three that I've been really liking Hyperbloom with Dehya. I've been really liking Hyperfridge, or I've been kind of liking Forward Vape with Xiangling, Kazuha, Zhongli. Although again, I don't actually like it that much. I can see it's strong, so I want to include it. It's going to be a team that scales very well with vertical investment. I don't find it pleasant to play, but I like it like in terms of strength. I actually quite like his Bain-Marie / Oven team, and that's basically it, honestly. In terms of like the teams that I would consider his best ones, I think these 4 archetypes stand slightly above the rest, even though the rest are not bad. I think I prefer these 4 a little bit more over the rest.
You can also play him in Freeze. He's going to be fine in Freeze. I wouldn't say that we have...
Yeah, I don't like him that much in Freeze. He's fine, but it's like, if he's taking the field time, you're not getting that much damage from cryo units, and then at that point, why not just play Hyperfridge, you know?
And you can play him in Nilou teams. He's gonna
Yeah, so in Nilou teams, he also does perform pretty well. I think the main thing about him in Nilou teams is that because he's got pretty decent single target damage, it helps Nilou teams a little bit to get over the potential single target issues that they can have. And even though he's not all that synergistic with the Nilou teams, because he's pretty strong because he's not that reliant on external buffs. Even without getting a lot of external buffs, he still does pretty fine. He's strong enough that even with the lack of synergy, he still fits fairly well. Yeah, I still think that, like, in general, I would prefer using the other Hydro units for Nilou teams. But if you're specifically, like, you know it's gonna be single target content with a tanky boss, then it's a fine option. Especially if you want to be using Xingqiu or Yelan on the other team.
So, very versatile character. I think he's very similar to Ayato in that sense. I would say that he's a little bit stronger than Ayato overall. Ayato's biggest strength, in terms of like the thing that separates him from other options, is how big his AoE is and how easy it is to consolidate it.
I think it's even easier to consolidate with Neuvillette after having played him a lot. In my first impressions, I still valued Ayato's AoE a bit more. I think that Ayato, in some of his teams, is easier to play in the sense that, like, it's pretty trivial to get Hydro Swirls with him. But in basically every other way, he's pretty much just weaker. He also obviously has still the Nilou team synergy if you're playing him in Nilou teams, because Ayato is a fairly underrated unit in Nilou teams, especially if you manage to get your hands on his Zyphos. But I definitely do think that Neuvillette has mostly overshadowed Ayato. Would I call it power creep? I don't think so. Neuvillette's lack of off-field just like whatsoever does mean that even though he's generally just better than Ayato in almost every Ayato team, there's still room for Ayato to do things that Neuvillette can't. So I don't know if power creep would be the right word, but he's definitely overall generally just a stronger option than Ayato.
That's basically going to do it for the Neuvillette pre-release. I'm fairly excited for him. I am planning on rolling for him. I hope this isn't a Wanderer situation where I'm pretty excited for them before the release.
I am happy to tell you it is not a Wanderer situation. He is actually pretty good. If anything, he's probably even a bit better than I actually gave him credit for in the pre-release. I don't really quantify how good I think a unit is because I think it's too easy to, like, if you don't have the context for that, it's too easy to misunderstand what I mean. So I try not to, like, ever quantify in my pre-releases like actually how good a unit will be, but I think it's pretty clear here that like I think he's a pretty good unit like overall, but in the post-release I'd say I didn't say exactly how strong I think he was, but I did think exactly how strong I thought he was, and I think he ended up being a little bit stronger than I thought he would be. I do want to evaluate how accurate my pre-release was, because I try to do that like whenever I do post-releases. I think it's important. I think when it comes to how strong he was, even though he ended up a little bit stronger than I give him credit for, I still don't think that like I was all that off for it. I do think he's around the same ballpark in terms of strength, right? He is a fairly strong unit that you can go for. But I do think that I missed the mark a little bit on some of the teams. I think that I definitely underrated his like quote unquote hyper carry, like forward vape. I still don't think it's like his best team. I think that, I mean, again, right, this Abyss makes it feel better than it actually is, but it is definitely one of his best teams, and I didn't value it nearly as much as I should have. And like obvious consequences of that, it makes some of the EM weapons slightly better, but outside of basically anything related to that specific, I guess, underestimation, I think the pre-release was overall pretty good, fairly accurate, and yeah. Bye, YouTube!